It is our privilege to have Bill Federer as our guest speaker this evening. Mr. Federer is a nationally renowned speaker, best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch, Inc., a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. His daily American Minute radio feature is a broadcast across the nation and online. His faith in history television broadcasts daily on TCT network stations nationwide and via DirecTV. Mr. Federer has authored over 20 books, including his seminal work, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, which has sold more than 500,000 copies. For more information about Mr. Federer, please visit AmericanMinute.com. Please join us in giving a warm, liberty-loving applause to Mr. Federer as he takes the podium.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor for me to be with you. I don't know if there's a little microphone that...
I got it. I just have a hard time getting rid of this thing. No.
Well, thank you, Jen, and I want you to know you are important people, that God has raised you up for such a time as this, and this is exciting. I get a chance to talk around the country, and sometimes people are like, oh, it's looking really bad. When you look at it from God's point of view, that He chose for you to be alive right now. He knows every dirty backroom deal, and He thinks you got what it takes, right? You're the Gideon, the Moses, the David, the Esther that He's raising up for this time, so be bold and courageous. Amen. Well, I have a couple books I wanted to mention. One is Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present, and I'm going to share some stuff out of that book tonight. And then a brand new book called Silence Equals Consent, and I'll talk about this tomorrow night at First Baptist Church in St. Genevieve. I go through how you're silent at a wedding ceremony, you're giving your consent, right? It's called the rule of tacit admission, T-A-C-I-T, and it's in real estate law. If you save up money, buy a rent house, and some squatter moves in, and if you're not trying to evict them or charge them rent, they can gain title to your rent house just by you being silent. It's called the rule of adverse possession. It's in debt collection law. Somebody owes you money, and you're silent for 10 years, and then you try to start collecting. The judge will say, you've been silent too long, you're past the statute of limitation, no money. And so if your silence gives consent to wedding vows, it gives consent to other things. And if all the church members we know that aren't getting involved, if they're silent, they're giving consent to all the wicked stuff going on there. If they're killing babies and they're silent, they're giving consent to killing babies. Yeah. If they're teaching the trans agenda and they're silent, they're giving consent. Would Jesus teach the trans agenda? No. We know what He taught, Matthew 19. He who made them at the beginning made them male and female. So their tactic is to guilt trip Christians into being more Christian than Christ. Right? If you're really Christian, you'll be silent and give your tacit approval to us teaching something to the kids that Jesus would never teach to the kids. I mean, think of it. Here are school teachers that cannot even define woman, yet they think they can tell that a little boy is supposed to be a little girl. You can't even define girl. It's illogical. And Jesus said, if you allow one of these little ones that believes in me to stumble, better than a millstone be put around your neck and you be thrown in the depths of the sea. Right? I did a 2-hour special with George Barna, who does polling, and he comes up with the statistics. The areas with the highest percentage of Christians have the lowest voter turnout. Wow. Oh, our kingdom's not of this world, and we just preach the gospel. It's like, yeah, but you're being silent toward all that stuff. You're giving your consent to it. You're going to be set up for judgment. So it's a really encouraging book. I have lots of stuff that you'll enjoy. Anyway, tonight I wanted to start off talking about something else that's in this book, Christian nationalism. Do you know that nationalism is the opposite of globalism? There are people who are globalists that want a one world government. And the first director of the World Health Organization, have you heard of that organization? Yeah. They're working on a treaty right now. Michelle Bachmann was talking about it, where if they declare there's another pandemic, all the countries will submit their sovereignty and let the World Health Organization shut down their whole country. They're working on that treaty, and they're trying to get it done by October, right before the election. Yeah. I believe if we pray and make a stink about it, they'll have to put that off. But the first director of the World Health Organization, Brock Chisholm, said To achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their national patriotism. So globalists do not like people that want to preserve their nation. Now, how are they going to get control of the world? Are they just going to ask people, hi, give us control of your life? Usually doesn't happen. And it's usually in times of crises. And so it's something called the Great Reset, where it's an orchestrated global crisis, a food shortage, a currency collapse, a health crisis, some crises. And, the head of the World Health Organization, Klaus Schwab, released a video, Agenda 2030, that said, you'll own nothing and be happy. Own nothing, own nothing. Sounds a lot like Karl Marx, who said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property. So abolition of private property means you'll own nothing. In other words, the globalists want world communism. And of course, they're going to be at the top, and they're smart, and they all think the world's overpopulated anyway. So nationalism is the opposite of globalism. Secondly, nationalism depends on the nation. In socialist nations, communist or Islamist nations, there are no individual rights, right? Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. There were no individual rights, ask the Jews. USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? There's no individual rights. America, our nation, is dedicated to individual rights from a creator. And since God gave it, the government cannot take it away. And so these rights include freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom to right to possess and bear arms, freedom to have a speedy trial by a jury of your peers, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. Those are sort of good things, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
And to top it all off, it's government from the consent of the governed. You get to be in charge. So our nation is different from socialist nations and Islamist nations. Over there, nationalism is bad. Over here, wanting to preserve our nation is good. Lincoln ended his Gettysburg Address that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Finally, did you know that Christian nationalism used to be called Christian patriotism? I have a Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. The word nationalism is not in there. The word patriotism is. Patriotism is the characteristic of a good citizen, love of one's country. And so all the leaders supported Christian patriotism. Here's George Washington. To the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian. Lincoln, inaugural address, said intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on him who is still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty. He mentions patriotism and Christianity right next to each other in his inaugural. Now, he was a Republican, freed the slaves, right? Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment. After him was Ulysses S. Grant, and he sent the federal troops to the South to protect the freed slaves from the Democrats. 13,000 pages of testimony of blacks being harassed by these Democrat vigilante groups, Jim Crow laws, black codes. And so Tuskegee Institute did research, and they documented over 4,700 lynchings. There were more than that, but those are documented. Did you know that 1,200 of those were white Republicans in the South registering the freed blacks to vote? And they were lynched too. So Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to have a black man as an honored guest in the White House, Booker T. Washington, the president of Tuskegee. Teddy Roosevelt said, "The mob lynches a Negro. Every Christian patriot in America needs to lift up his voice in loud and eternal protest against the mob spirit." And then you have FDR during World War II. He passes out Gideon's New Testaments and Book of Psalms to all the soldiers. Millions of them. Blue ones to the Navy, brown ones to the Army. I have a copy. He wrote the foreword that says, "As Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces." I mean, here he is defending our nation against Imperial Japan and the Nazis, and he's passing out New Testaments. I wonder if the mainstream media would call Franklin Roosevelt a Christian nationalist. He said those forces hate democracy and Christianity as two phases of the same civilization. They oppose democracy because it's Christian. They oppose Christianity because it preaches democracy. FDR said the whole world is divided between pagan brutality and the Christian ideal. We choose human freedom, which is the Christian ideal. Now, he was on the left back then, but since then, both the left and the right have moved to the left, and so his statements are on the right comparatively. And then Eisenhower. He said, any group that awakens all of us is a dedicated, patriotic group that can well take the Bible in one hand, the flag in the other, and march ahead. They saw no problem having a Bible and a flag. And in 1965, 93% of Americans identified as Christian. 93%. 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, and then 3% of the country was Jewish. The country was always predominantly Judeo-Christian and patriotic. The left engages in something called projection, where they blame you for what they're doing. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. Right? Little kids do it. I didn't start the fight, you did. A cheating spouse will accuse the faithful spouse of being unfaithful, right? It's a narcissistic response mechanism where somebody is caught doing something wrong, they immediately blame the person that caught them. And so they are the ones that are setting up a nationalism. It's a woke nationalism. It's a transgendered nationalism. And they are not tolerant of your views, right? They're the ones that are being trampling on people's views. And they say, we got to be careful. Those Christians want dominionism. It's like, we want freedomism. We just don't want you pushing your views on us and our kids. Now, why does the mainstream media always call pro-life people anti-abortion? There's no pro-life group that puts on their sign, anti-abortion group. No, they put pro-life. But every single news article will call pro-life people anti-abortion. Why do they do that? Negative word association. Anti has a negative feel to it. Why do they call Christian patriots Christian nationalists? Negative word association. They want a boogeyman. And so this is an interesting article. It says, follow the money to the after party. So the globalists, remember we talked about the globalists? A globalist like Rockefeller, bankrolling after-party Bible studies is a red flag. The same grant round is a group seeking to promote leadership of rural LGBTQ people. So Rockefeller and these globalists are giving money to woke seminaries so they'll teach Christians not to get involved in politics, while at the same time they're giving money to their LGBTQ activists to get them involved in politics. What a brilliant strategy. Silence your opposition and give money to your supporters. Now, tyrants, I write about this in my book on socialism. By the way, I want to mention another book my wife put together called Miracles in American History. So times, Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War, where it looks really bad and we have leaders that call us to fast and pray and be courageous and things turn around. Wow. So she hears me talk, she says, get to the good part where things turn around. So you'll want to get that book. So in my book on socialism, I go through how Plato said democracy's doomed to fail because it's based on people having virtue, and people really don't have virtue, because if you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. And Plato goes on, he goes, if somebody was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. He wrote that in 380 BC. So by the time Plato was alive, Greece had a bunch of gods that nobody believed in. And so there was no motivation to be virtuous other than it's the end thing. And he says this isn't going to last, right? Now Israel, they had a republic that first 400 years out of Egypt, and theirs lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And you were virtuous because you were accountable to God. But Athens didn't have that. It just had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in. And so Plato said that this democracy is doomed to fail because people will give up their virtue, they'll give into their selfish side, they'll turn into chaos and and random violence, and then everybody will go and say, we need somebody to fix this. And so along will come a protector who will promise to fix it, but he usurps power and becomes a dictator. And as he's usurping power, he tells the people that he's taking the power for their own good. I'm taking a little bit of your freedom, but I'm doing it for your own good, I'm doing it for your own good. And it's fraud. The leader's lying to you. And after a while, people stop believing the fraud. And the leader's popularity falls. And the only other tool in the tyrant's toolbox is force. So when a leader drops precipitously in public opinion polls, their only other way to stay in power is to purge the law enforcement of anybody with virtue, anybody with morals. They want to purge the Department of Justice, purge the FBI, purge the Secret Service, purge the military. If anybody with morals and virtue, all they want is yes men. It's a gang. It's no different than the Bloods and the Crips. You got to do what the gang leader says. And so Pericles was the leader of Athens in 431 BC. And it was a democracy. And he was getting a little bit too much power. And so people began to complain. People stopped believing the fraud that he was telling them, oh, I'm borrowing money from the treasury, and I'm going to build my Parthenon, but I'm doing it for, and he'd have all these excuses. And then rumors spread that they were going to ostracize him. It was sort of like invoking the 25th Amendment. And so there were 6,000 citizens in Athens, and they could have a recall vote, and they could ostracize you, which means they kick you out of town for 10 years, and your political career is pretty much over. And so when this rumor was spreading of this invoking the 25th Amendment type thing, Pericles decided to let relations with Sparta deteriorate on purpose so that they would get into a war with Sparta called the Peloponnesian War. And then, once they were in the war, everybody wanted a strong leader. So they stopped criticizing him because of this war, and then they wanted to get behind him. And that became the standard operating procedure. Whenever a leader that is taking rights from people and freedom becomes unpopular, the next thing he wants to do is to get a crisis going, a war, and then everybody forgets what they did, and then they'll focus on something else. And so this is what Plato wrote. How then does the protector begin to change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. Then the unpopular tyrant claims his life is threatened. Then comes the famous request for a bodyguard, and then he goes on. The tyrant loses popularity, purges his military, law enforcement, and then he uses this. Now, William Henry Harrison was the 9th president, and he was only president for 30 days because he caught a pneumonia. But he did give a really good inaugural. And so this is what he writes. The danger to all free governments arises from the unwillingness of the people to believe in the influence of designing men. This is the old trick of those who would usurp the government of their country. In the name of democracy, they speak. We got to preserve democracy. Have you heard that? In the name of democracy, they speak, warning the people against the influence of wealth. History, ancient and modern, is full of such examples. The tendency of all such governments in their decline is to monarchy, right? Concentrated power. The spirit of faction, or breaking into the parties. A spirit which in times of great excitement imposes itself upon the people as the genuine spirit of freedom. And like the false Christs, whose coming was foretold by the Savior, seeks to, and were it possible, impose upon the true and most faithful disciples of liberty. Did you know that a president warned of the Antichrist in his inaugural address? William Henry Harrison, he says, okay, you're going to have these people saying, we got to preserve democracy. I need a little bit more power to do it. And there is difficulty in distinguishing the false from the true. The true spirit of liberty is mild and tolerant, whilst the spirit of party assumes that to be of liberty, harsh, vindictive, intolerant, totally reckless. The reign of an intolerant party spirit seldom fails to result in the dangerous ascension of the executive power, that's the president, introduced amidst unusual professions of devotion to democracy. I know it's sort of old-fashioned wording, but here he says that you're going to have the executive power give unusual professions of devotion to democracy, while at the same time he's going to seize a lot of power. And so, did you get anything out of that? I mean, I read history, and people say history repeats itself. Really, human nature repeats itself. And so you can see how humans have acted in the past, and you can have some predictive ability. I tell people history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. Past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. Right? You're going to hire somebody for a job. Well, how are they going to do? Well, how they do in their last job. You're going to buy a cow. How much milk is it going to produce? Well, how much milk did it produce last year? Right? I mean, you look at this track record, and history provides that. Now, one of the chapters in my book on socialism is how to brainwash a nation. And I think this is sort of fascinating because it's being done on us. This is the old YMCA logo, Spirit, Mind, and Body, John 17:21, they'll know you're one. Did you know? A Young Men's Christian Association. They had and so spirit, mind, and body. Your spirit is drawn to God. Your body, your flesh is drawn away from God. And so the mind is sort of the battlefield. It sort of determines who wins, right? The spirit or the flesh. And so the battle is for the mind. And Karl von Clausewitz, a 19th century military theorist, gave the purpose of war. The purpose of war is to force your opponent to submit to your will. Pretty simple. So you go through all this trouble of weapons and battle strategy, but the whole goal is to get your opponent to submit to your will. Well, Sun Tzu's Art of War, 5th century BC, said supreme excellence in a commander consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. So if the goal is to get them to submit, a really good commander can get your enemy to submit without even fighting. Right? You psych them out. You make them think you're more powerful than you are, you're more places than you are. You know Sun Tzu's famous saying, know your enemy and know yourself. And now it's called 5th generation warfare, where you get your enemy to surrender without them even being aware they're in a war. If their goal is to get them to submit, and it's really good to get them to submit without a fight, what if you could get them to submit without them even waking up to know they're in a war? And so we did some of these psychological operations during World War II. We dropped pamphlets down on German villages and Polish. I met a guy whose grandfather had been in Poland in World War II, and he had one of the pamphlets that the American planes had dropped, and it said, your side has already lost, your commander just hasn't told you yet. And so these guys are out there fighting. I read that we already lost. And it demoralized them. And the Japanese did it to us. Tokyo Rose, a woman with a seductive voice on radio, and it carried across the ocean to our ships, and it would say, you Americans are doing terrible stuff, and it would demoralize our guys. And it's in the Bible, this battle for the mind. 12 spies go into the promised land, 10 come back with a negative report. There are giants in the land, we're grasshoppers, the land devours the inhabitants thereof. And all of Israel got defeated in their brain. Let's stone Moses, let's elect somebody else to take us back to Egypt. And God was so mad that he struck those 10 spies dead on the spot, and the rest he said, you're going to wander for 40 years till every one of you is dead. They got defeated in their mind before they ever got onto the battlefield. And then another one of these stories is Hezekiah is the king, and the Assyrian ambassador comes to the walls, and the Israelite ambassadors, they speak to us in the Hebrew language, we can understand it, or the Aramaic language, Syrian language. And they said, no, we want to speak in your language, because we want everybody on the walls to know. And they said, you're going to, and they say all this terrible stuff to try to demoralize them. But in the Bible, the good way it was used was Gideon. There's 100,000 Midianites, and Gideon gets 10,000 Israelites, and God said, too many. Tell everyone that's scared to go home. And now he's down to fewer. He had 30,000, then to 10,000, then he got to 300. And God said, okay, get some torches, cover them with a clay pot, and have your trumpets and station yourselves all around those 300. And then when the signal's given, you all smash the pot at the same time and blow the trumpet. And all they're doing is they're standing there. They're not running, they're not moving, they're just standing there blowing the trumpet, holding the torch. And the Midianites got defeated in their mind. They jumped up in the dark, they're bumping into each other, they're pulling out their swords, and they're fighting and killing each other. So the battle is for the mind. And perfect love casts out fear. So they want to get us into fear. That's their goal. Fear paralyzes. Fear demoralizes. They want to get you into fear. And over again, the Bible says, fear not, fear not. Perfect love casts out fear. Right? So when you feel overwhelmed, you need to spend some time in the Word of God. Right? When you feel like, oh, it's so terrible, you feel like you need to hang around some of your Christian friends. You need to pray, right? I was thinking of the Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, right? And I thought, Our Father who art in heaven. Now, there's the sky, which is called heaven, then there's the heaven with the stars, and then there's the heaven where God is. But even just the heaven where the stars are, it's 93 billion light years across, and still expanding at the speed of light. And the largest star they found is Stephenson 2-18. It's so large, if you were to place it in our solar system, it would engulf the orbit of Saturn. And when you begin to start dwelling on how big God is, it makes your problem look real teeny. And it builds your faith that God can take care of your problem. He can do all, he's holding that in existence the same way that he's in this room and he's inside of you right now. Right? He's a big God. We can trust him. Anyway, so the battle for the mind. The current situation began with marketing. Marketing of products. In the 1800s, marketing was Wells Fargo wagon and Sears catalog, and they would list every detail about a Singer sewing machine, and you would make an informed purchase. And but then in the early 1900s, you had magazine advertising. And they realized you didn't have to say anything about a product. You just make it look like everybody's using it. And the classic was Crisco. Nobody knew what was in Crisco. Yet they put these advertisements that you have these happy families and it looks like everybody's using it, everybody's happy, and we've all eaten it. Do you know what's in Crisco? Cottonseed oil. The Deep South, they would harvest cotton and have mountains of black seeds that they would mush into this industrial oil that they would use in factories and machinery. Nobody ate that stuff. But somebody had the idea of bleaching it, put it in these containers with this nice fabric. It was so successful, it put out of business the lard industry. Right? So they went from knowing everything about a product to knowing nothing. They even invented a term, vegetable-based, right? Because they didn't want to really tell you what was in it. And the Keeping Up with the Joneses was a cartoon that made fun of this, that you'd buy something because somebody else had it, even though you didn't know anything about it. And so the person that introduced this type of marketing is Edward Bernays. He's the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud is the one who discovered that we are social creatures. We will do what we see other people doing. And we want to be accepted, and so we'll adopt the dress, the clothes, the styles, because we want to be accepted in a group, and we don't want to be rejected from a group. And he's the one who pushed smoking cigarettes. He's the one that he pushed this advertising, and he wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928. And he even talked about women's shoes. He said women go into a department store and think they're picking out shoes. They're not. The marketing executive picked out the shoes for them and paid the actors to put them on and paid the photographer to take the pictures and paid to put it in the magazines and the women see it and buy it. He says, a large manufacturer of women's shoes has a popular actress wear the shoes, the fashion spreads. The man who injected this idea into the shoe industry was ruling women in one department of their social lives. Today, the minority has discovered a powerful help in influencing the majority to mold the minds of the masses. They find in propaganda a tool which is increasingly powerful, regimenting the public mind. And so, yes, he pushed the cigarettes, and he decided to change the name of propaganda to public relations. A little more palatable, and because he said, in almost every area of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics, business, social conduct, ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. So our declaration, we're government from the consent of the governed. But what if you could engineer the consent of the governed? And so he wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent. Manipulation of the opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. And so then he writes another book, The Crystallizing Public Opinion. And then somebody else, Noam Chomsky, wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. And Oswald Spengler writes, democracy has become a weapon of the moneyed interests. It uses the media to create the illusion that there is consent of the governed. The press today is an army of carefully organized weapons. It's journalists, it's officers, it's readers, it's soldiers. The reader neither knows nor is supposed to know the purposes for which he is used, the role he is to play. Democracy is often a government of wealthy elites. So they have the money, and instead of them pushing Crisco or women's shoes, they push a leftist ideology. And they push it in the schools, and they push it, now it's done online. They want to cancel voices that don't agree with them. And one of the early iterations of this was the Spanish-American War. And just 90 miles off the coast, you had Spain wanting to put down a rebellion in Cuba, and they would take the people and put them in stockades, and like 250,000 died. And word comes across, there's the Spanish, they're starving people. And so Americans didn't want to get involved, and so the newspaper publishers began to push American involvement. They printed on inexpensive paper that would turn yellow after a couple days. Remember, you'd put them in your bird cages and stuff. And so they called it yellow press because the papers turned yellow. And one was William Randolph Hearst and his New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer Prize, and his New York World. And Hearst sent the illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba. Now, they did not have the ability to print photographs yet, and so they would have to have an artist do etchings. And so the people were starving. This is the Spanish governor, Weyler, and he was the one starving them. And so Hearst cabled Remington in 1897, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. Right? He had this confidence that his newspaper could do what? Swing public opinion. And then the public would pressure the politicians, and the politicians would decide to get involved and come to Cuba's help. But it's this understanding that we're group creatures, and we'll do what we see other people doing. You know, a water molecule is an individual water molecule, but you put it with other water molecules, and they operate as a group, with clouds and waves. A fish is an individual in a bowl, but you put it with other fish and they operate in a group. A bird in a cage, but you put it with other birds, they operate in a group. I talked to somebody that was a former military cybersecurity algorithm type person, and he was talking about how in the 1980s, when they first started coming up with the internet, and they saw people going online, the question was, they wondered if people will follow news articles as a group. sort of like the birds will follow, right? And so they began to collect the data on everybody. And because then they could begin to see which way the groups are going, and then they would isolate who is the leader of the group, which is the first bird that decides to turn, and then the other one's turn. And then they would want to isolate that and then silence them, right? And so they supposedly have a room like NASA, with big maps and TV screens on the wall, and when they would release a story, they could see it's trending, and they can see who is forwarding it to who's forwarding it to who's forwarding it to who, and they'd see it spread, And then if somebody started a counter narrative that would begin to cancel back, then they would try to isolate where's that coming from, and we got to deplatform that person. And so we operate as a group, right? We're individuals, but we're social creatures. We're constantly giving and receiving feedback if we are being accepted or rejected. And now at the beginning of America, the majority of the country was Christian. At the time of the Revolution, 98% of the country was Protestant, 3 million people, 1% Catholic, 30,000. Catholics were only allowed in 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and 0.1% Jewish. There were only 7 synagogues in the whole country. And then there was an Irish potato famine, and millions of Irish Catholics come to America. And in the early 1800s, the Catholic percentage goes from 1% to 20%. And then there's a persecution of Jews in Bavaria in the middle 1800s. 250,000 Jews come across. They go from 0.1% to 1%. Right? But at the founding of the country was predominantly Judeo-Christian. And so if there was a non-Christian, they would adopt Christian behavior because they wanted to fit in with a Christian society. Now, we'd be more than happy for them to be a real Christian, but at least they would adopt the behavior. Well, now, guess what? They control the public opinion molding, and they're pushing an anti-Christian pressure. And most of the world calls this phenomenon honor-shame culture. And so in China, your worth goes up if you are honored in front of your group, and your worth goes down if you're shamed in front of your group. I talked to somebody that was in business in Japan, and they said that you would never, ever point at somebody in a board meeting and point them out for doing something wrong, because they'll go out and commit suicide, right? You publicly shame them. It's like so terrible, right? And in Islam, it's a honor-shame culture, where if if the community called the Ummah honors you, your worth goes up. But if your daughter embarrasses you in front of your community, they'll murder their own daughter, right? And so it's a total honor-shame culture. They want to be honored by their group. They don't want to be shamed. And so they've hacked human behavioral software. Think of Disney. Think of the billions of dollars of product that they push. Frozen t-shirts, frozen skateboards, frozen backpacks, games, and lots of dollars worth of product is being pushed, and it's all based on what? Convincing a little child to want something. All of this big machinery, and it's pushing millions of dollars of product, it's all based on getting a little child to want something. They study child psychology, and children are social creatures. They want what they see other people at. They want to be accepted by all their friends. It's a very important part of their development stage. They want to be accepted. They don't want to be rejected. They don't want to be not invited to the party. They don't want to be not picked for the team, right? And so now they've weaponized it, and they put it all in the classroom. And it's called social emotional learning. And so they prey upon these kids' desire to fit in and their fear of being rejected. And they weaponize loneliness, right? Saul Alinsky said, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. And so they get the kids together in the classroom, and they have the pyramid of oppression. And at the top of the pyramid are the cisgendered. That's their name for somebody that believes there is a male and a female. If you're at the top of the pyramid, you are the oppressor. You're the bad guy. And then down the pyramid are the asexual, bisexual, homosexual, pansexual, trans, anything sexual. And they're all being oppressed by this top of the pyramid. And they ask the kids, which ones are you? Well, none of them are going to pick the bad guy, the oppressor, so they'll pick anything else. And so it works. And this is Maryland's largest school district sees 500% increase in non-binary trans students since Biden's been in. Here's another one. Trans-identifying students increased 991% over 2 years in wealthy DC suburb. It works. Here's one. 1,800 students at UC Davis identify as trans, non-binary, and 25% of all students says they are LGBT. Here's one. Unprecedented 5,000% surge in trans teens. It works. The last 3 years, while we've been doing whatever we've been doing, they have been using this machinery, social emotional learning, and they've been getting these kids in the classroom and said, if you hold old traditional values, you're the bad person. And nobody wants to be the bad person. And then when somebody chooses one of the other things, they applaud them and celebrate them and have the posters all on the school walls. And Elon Musk gives a heartbreaking account of how he was tricked into consenting to his son's puberty blockers. And he said his trans child was figuratively killed by the woke mind virus. And he vows to destroy it. My son is dead. Right? So they come in and they mess with the child. Now, I talked to a doctor. He says, we study development. It's a normal developmental stage for children that are from 4 to 10, that girls want to play with girls and boys want to play with boys. And they come in and they say, if you're a little girl and you like to play with little girls, maybe you're a lesbian. And if you're a little boy and you like to play with little boys, maybe you're gay. And so for 10 years growing up, they got this thought in the back of their head, well, I can play with boys, maybe I'm gay. They put this woke mind virus in these little kids. It's cruel, it's criminal. I was in Rochester, Minnesota. They have a whole wing of the hospital for minor transgender surgeries, gender-affirming surgeries. And lo and behold, now the statistics are coming out. After they get the surgery, the rate of suicide increases. Yeah. What about all that they were telling us? Well, now you have to let your kid be trans. Would you rather have a live daughter or a dead somewhere, however they do that? Well, guess what? I found out that it's their agenda that increases them being suicidal and homicidal. They finally leaked that note from that trans killer in Nashville that went into a Christian school and killed all those people. And so the battle is for the brain, for the mind. Brainwashing, did you know that term came from Buddhism? Where you would, they meditate, they blank their mind out, and they would cleanse their mind, right? But so it's called brainwashing. And anyway, it was used against our soldiers during the Korean War in prison. World War II, the soldiers survived. They put them in Stalag 13, and then the guys had their camaraderie, and they would encourage each other and everything. But the Koreans isolated the soldiers for weeks, for months, until they got to a vulnerable emotional state where they craved just wanting to talk to another human, just wanting to get a slap on the back and be one of the buddies, And when they were at this vulnerable spot, they would bring him into a room of soldiers who had already caved. And before they could be accepted in the group and get that emotional reinforcement, they had to reject America. Yeah, America's bad, America's terrible. Oh yeah, okay, you're one of us now. And it went into their psyche so much that after they were rescued, they still hated America. And so they also would get these prisoners to do trivial things and demand minute obedience and then change it up all the time. So our human brain is wired so that we want to know why we're doing something. Even if we're in prison and we're moving a bunch of stones over there, we know that they're going to build a wall. But these communists would get them to move the stones over and then the next day move them back where they came from. and then move them back over, and then halfway through the day move them back, and then have some, you bring it this way, and you bring it, and it made no sense until finally these guys say, okay, I'm going to stop trying to figure out what I'm doing. I'm just a zombie. You just tell me what to do. All right? Every time I go through the airport, they're like, okay, you got to take your shoes off. No, you got to put your shoes in the box. No, you got to take your belt off. Now you have to take it out of the bag. No, you don't have to take it out of the bag. I mean, everyone's different. Until finally, like, okay, I'm just going to just tell me whatever. Show your license. So don't show your ticket. Don't do it. I mean, that they found that the people that resisted brainwashing had a sense of humor. Okay, we're going to do this again, right? So that's an encouragement to us to. So the idea, is this interesting?
Yeah.
So one of the experiments they did to try to study how we want to be accepted, we don't want to be rejected, was the Solomon Asch conformity experiment. And it was done on college campuses in the 60s and 70s. And they would pull 8 students into a classroom. 7 had been paid ahead of time to be actors. 1 was a naive participant. And the teacher put 2 cards on the front desk. 1 card had 1 line, and the other had 3 lines. 1 longer, 1 shorter, 1 the same. And beginning with the paid actors, one by one they would go around the room and convincingly say that the shorter line was equal to the first line. And they would go around and they just describe it and everything, and finally got around to the 8th naive participant, and 30% of them would deny their own eyes to fit in with the group. They're looking at the lines with their own eyes. They are not equal. Yet they'll want to fit in with the group so much, they'll doubt their perception. They'll doubt what they think. Well, these other people must know more than I do, whatever. Right? But if only one other person objected, it went from 30% down to 5%. Right? So if we see something and we know it's not right and we feel this pressure, we need to shut ourselves up. If we just speak out and say, this isn't right, guess what? A whole bunch of 25% of the other people are going to come out of the closet and say, I was thinking the same thing. Thank you for having the courage to say it. And they call this the spiral of silence, where a person will self-censor their own views if they think they are in the minority. Right? So if you think, I'm the only one that thinks this, I better be quiet. Right? They want to, and so they do this online, where they want to silence all the opinions that are different than theirs, and then you'll feel like, oh, I'm the oddball. Chuck Colson talked about a wine tasting test, and everybody was in on it except one naive couple. And they poured vinegar in the wine. And this couple writes on their little card, this tastes terrible. But one by one, the other couples would say, this tasted really good. It was robust, it had character, this, that. The couple that had written it tastes terrible, they scratched out what they wrote, and they agreed with everybody else. Oh yeah, it tasted really good. And then when somebody said all they did was pour vinegar in the wine, the person that changed their views criticized the person for saying they poured vinegar in the wine. And it's a phenomenon called false enforcement. Once people buy into a lie, they will help enforce that other people buy into the lie. It's like little electrons, they all sort of line up. It's like, I don't know why I'm wearing this on my face, but I'm going to pull out my thing. You're not wearing yours, right? And so once humans comply with the group, they'll force others to. And then this was an interesting study. After World War II, they said, well, were all those Germans that killed the Jews bad people? And so they did an experiment at Yale, the Stanley Milgram shock experiment. And so they advertised in the local newspaper for volunteers to be part of an education experiment. And they needed teachers and learners. Well, guess what? All the learners were in on it. And so they took the teacher through the building, past a room where they were tying up the learner with wires, hooking him to electrical stuff. Now, he really wasn't hooked up to electrical stuff, but the teacher didn't know that. And he's walking past this room, he sees them tying this guy up with all these wires, And then the teachers put it in a different room down the hall with the doors open, with a machine with switches. And whenever the learner, and he would have a microphone, and he'd ask the learner a question through the microphone, and it would go into his room. And if the learner got the question wrong, he was to flip one of the switches, and it would send a shock. And the guy in the other room would go, ow! And then he'd ask him another question, he'd get it wrong, and then he would flip another switch, he'd go, ow! And then he'd get another one wrong, he'd go, ow! And then another one, ah! So pretty soon he's just screaming. And the teacher would turn to this guy in the white coat and say, shouldn't you check on him? And they go, this is science, it must continue. And he's like, well, okay. And then he's giving him more shocks. So the guy's like just writhing in pain and stuff. So shouldn't you check on him? And then it goes quiet. He asks him another question, and there's no answer. He says, shouldn't you check on him? They go, this is science, it must continue. Until finally the guy just keeps, he gives him 450 volts, enough to kill somebody, just because there's somebody in a lab coat that says this is science, it must continue. So, the battle for the mind. During World War II, we talked about the pamphlets being dropped and Tokyo rose, but then we have the Cold War. And Truman does nothing because he thinks the United Nations that he helped form will bring world peace. But while he's doing nothing, country by country is falling to the Soviets, called behind the Iron Curtain. So what the Soviets did was send KGB agents into these countries, Germany, France, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, India, and these KGB agents would study all the groups in the country and classify them as victims or oppressors, haves and have-nots. Ethnically, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, economically, racially, didn't matter. And they would call some victims and others oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would stir them up to fight, to protest. And then they would whip it into violence and bloodshed. Why bloodshed? Because then people think emotionally and not logically. And then you would have all these people upset, and then they would co-opt the media to channel all that upsetness toward the new leader of the new country. And as his popularity fell, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And so country after country is falling to the Soviets. And we stopped France from falling by the Marshall Plan. We sent over there a bunch of money, and so that they could give out money so people weren't upset, right? But these other countries were falling. And so the next president is Eisenhower, and he doesn't want any more countries to fall to the Soviet Union. So he has the Secretary of State is John Foster Dulles. The airport's named after him in Virginia. And then his brother's Allen Dulles, who runs the CIA. And the situation is that Iran is beginning to side with the Soviet Union, and he doesn't want Iran to side with the Soviet Union. So we go over there, and we, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., he's the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, and he co-ops the groups, and they stage protests and riots, and then they co-opt the media, and they blame the leader, Mossadegh, for all the problems. And when he falls in popularity, they do a coup and replace him with the Shah. So the CIA did this in Congo and Guatemala, and the KGB did it, helping Che Guevara to take over with ELN, Bolivia, and FARC in Colombia. So the idea was the CIA was trying to get America to realize the Soviet threat, and we were too busy with coming out of World War II. And so they started something called Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA would have plants in the media, and the CIA would feed a story to their people, and they would publish it in the news. And we thought we were just getting plain news, but we were getting news slanted with the motive to get us to realize that there was a Soviet threat. And once it became public, they canceled it, but Obama brought it back in 2016. It's called the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which gives the president control of the media for the sake of national security, to monitor all the stories and to cancel some stories. And And so here you have Rand Paul. He's grilling Homeland Security Mayorkas about a disinformation governance board. And Rand Paul says, do you know the greatest propagator of disinformation in world history, the history of the world, the U.S. government? I think you've got no idea what disinformation is. Are you familiar with McNamara, Pentagon Papers? Familiar with George W. Bush, weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I don't want government guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. Do you think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? And we're all having our eyes opened just yesterday and today with the head of the Secret Service just not answering any questions. And it's like, wait a second, something's going on here. And Rand Paul, I don't trust the government to figure out what truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation. And here is Unica Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough, and she talks about how it's our job to control what people think. And Facebook, right? They swayed people, and you looked at all these big tech people. One of the ways they did it was with search results. So if you put in a candidate's name like Trump, it would pull up all the negative articles. And if you put in, a candidate like Biden or Hillary, it would pull up all the positive articles. And
both of them?
Pardon?
Both of the positive articles?
Yeah.
I wouldn't need more than that.
Yeah. And see, remember President Biden brings in TikTok stars to help sway public opinion over Russia's invasion of Ukraine? It's like, what? And here's another guy. You cannot let these guys control discourse in this country or we're headed to hell. This is a CNN analyst. And he doesn't like the fact that Musk bought Twitter. And here's BlackRock, which controls trillions of dollars. And he's pushing the critical race theory and everything. He speaks out openly about corporations forcing behaviors on ordinary people. So, now one of the stories in the Bible was wicked King Zedekiah. And the prophet Jeremiah comes to him and says, if you surrender to the king of Babylon, Jerusalem will be spared. And Zedekiah says, well, if I surrender, what will the Jews in captivity say about me? It's like, you just had the prophet of the Lord say the city's going to be burnt to the ground, and you care about what other people are going to say about you? See, that's that power of wanting to be accepted in a group. He was willing to let this whole city be burnt to the ground because they might say something bad about me. They might post something negative on the internet about me. And then the story of Peter. He's with a group around a fire. And a girl gets in his face and says, you were with Jesus. And you can just picture Peter looking around the fire and everybody's eyeing him. And he realizes he's about to get kicked out of this group. And he says, I never met the guy. Like, that's it, Peter? You caved so quick? You were just with Jesus? It is a real fear to have a newspaper publish negative things about you. It lies. It hurts. And Peter caved. But after the resurrection, Peter's filled with the Holy Spirit. And the Sanhedrin said, we gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. Peter replied, we must obey God rather than men. Suddenly, Peter doesn't care about what the newspaper says. He doesn't care about what they're posting about him. Right? He doesn't care that he's going to be pushed out of the synagogue, out of a group. I mean, that's the most important group in Jerusalem, and he's threatened to be kicked out. He says, I don't care. He says, we must obey God rather than men. It's only when you have a relationship with God can you not care about what other people say about you. That's it. Right? As long as you're drawing your self-worth from what other people say about you, you're always going to bend. I want people to say nice things about me. But when you only care about what God says about you, you're freed from that. Yeah. And Jeremiah, God said, be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee. Exodus 23:2, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Sam Coonrod was a Giants pitcher, and he was the only one not to kneel in protest to the American flag. And afterwards they asked him why. He said, I'm a Christian, so I just believe that I can't kneel before anything besides God. right? It's only when you have a relationship with God do you not care what other people say. And you have Jonathan Isaac, and he is a Orlando Magic basketball player, only one not to kneel. And afterwards they asked him why. He goes, all lives are supported through the gospel. Everyone is made in the image of God, and we all share in his glory. And when the early church was persecuted, they didn't pray for the persecution to stop. They just prayed for boldness. Another thing that we have often overlooked is Jesus asked the apostles, who do men say that I am? And some say thou art John the Baptist, some Elijah, some Jeremiah. And of course, Peter said thou art the Christ. But if you think of it, who was John the Baptist? He stood up to the corrupt government leader, King Herod. Who was Elijah? He stood up to the corrupt government leaders, Ahab and Jezebel. Who was Jeremiah? He stood up to the corrupt kings, King Jehoiakim and King Zedekiah. And they're mistaking Jesus for him. Right? We need to be like Jesus. We need to have some backbone. I'm convinced it's only when people have the Holy Spirit do they have the boldness to stand up to corruption, to stand up to preach the gospel, but also to stand up for the innocent, stand up for the children, and say, I don't care about what people say about me. This is right, this is wrong. And even Jesus, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who made himself of no reputation. Right? He hung almost naked on the cross. So we want approval by God, and we don't care about the approval by man. And is this interesting?
Yes.
How am I doing? Is this okay? I've got some more slides if you want me to keep going. All right. The Chinese had an emperor Qin, and he died, and his son Fusu reigned. And he had a chancellor named Li Si and a eunuch Zhao Gao. And Zhao Gao wanted to stage a coup against this new emperor. And he wanted to find out who was loyal to him and who was loyal to the emperor. And so he brought a deer into the royal court, and in front of the emperor and all the people, he says, I want you to see my new horse. And the emperor's like, it's not a horse, it's a deer. And then the people siding with the emperor said, yeah, that's not a horse, that's a deer. But some of the other ones were like, well, it could be a horse. And Zhao Gao used that to decide, okay, which ones, want to side with me, which ones want to side with the emperor, and he assassinated all of them, and then he did his coup. And but this idea that you could see something and deny your own eyes is a phenomenon. British critic Theodore Dalrymple said, in my study of communist societies, when people are forced to remain silent when they are being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they're forced to repeat the lies, they lose all sense of probity, integrity, honesty, virtue. So when they force him to say, okay, the guy's really a girl, it's like, but he's not a girl. But okay, I'll say it. Right? When you deny yourself and you say it, it says you lose your sense of self-respect. To assent to obvious lies is in some way to become evil oneself. And here's this guy, and I met Riley Gaines. I mean, this guy's like 6-something, and he's a whole head taller than these girls, and he tied with Riley Gaines for the NCAA championship, down to the 1/100th of a second. And they only had one trophy, so they gave it to him. And she decided, instead of going away quiet into the sunset, she became vocal. And she's been on Charlie Kirk and Jordan Peterson, and Joe Rogan, and all that. Yeah. Now, the other thing is education. And so we talked about the media, but the education is another thing, that they want to erase history. And Mao Zedong did this. It's called the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, where he destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China. He destroyed the Great Gates of Beijing. He destroyed thousands of years of Chinese history because he didn't want people going back. He wanted them to embrace his new People's Republic of China. And so they did public shaming, and they burnt this history. And this was even recently, Mongolia has a hero named Genghis Khan, and they were going to have an exhibition in Paris, but the Chinese were upset that Genghis Khan, he was Mongolian, he was not Chinese, and he controlled China for a century. And so the pure Chinese considered that an embarrassing part of their history. And so when they were going to do this exhibition in Paris on Genghis Khan, Xi Jinping calls Paris and says, "You're not going to do this." And so they canceled it. So the idea of canceling history is still going on. And at the same time they were pulling down statues over here, they were pulling down statues of Genghis Khan over in China. Pol Pot did the same thing. During the Khmer Rouge, he killed 25% of his country, and he didn't like history, so he made 1975 the new year zero. He said anything prior to that's irrelevant. And he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. And when Islam comes into a country, they destroy history. The oldest library in the world was in Alexandria, Egypt. And when the Muslim Caliph went in there, they asked him what to do with all these books. And he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant, because we have the Quran, so destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. And they're still doing it today, right? And so now we have the 1619 Project and Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And all it does is rewrite history to say everybody in America's past is bad. Forget the fact that they gave you a form of government where you're in charge, that you have rights from a creator and everybody's equal. Forget all that. They're all bad. And they want to rewrite this history. Carl Sandburg said, when a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from. And somebody named George Orwell wrote the book 1984. He wrote it in 1948, so you can switch the numbers. And the pneumatic tube was a new invention, like when you deposit in a bank. And his job, he worked for the government. Like Mayorkas's disinformation committee, he worked for the Ministry of Truth. And he would get down this pneumatic tube the history that was supposed to be edited. And he would take his little penknife and cut out the real history and put it in another pneumatic tube and send it into the incinerator in the basement. It was called Down the Memory Hole. And he would do this all day long, re-editing history. And he said every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it. Even when I did the falsification myself, after the thing is done, no evidence remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know that any other human being shares my memories. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became truth. If there's no God, there's no absolute truth. Why? If you can lie about a current story, you can lie about history, because it's just old stories. If it helps you to achieve your agenda, right? And so that's what they're doing. They want to take all our history and say everybody was bad. Orwell said, those who control the past control the future. Those who control the present control the past. So if you control the present, you get to decide what's in the history books about the past. And then we have Orson Welles and the radio drama War of the Worlds in 1938. We interrupt this program to announce that New Jersey is being invaded by Martians. And they did it as if it was really happening. And the whole entire country immediately panicked in fear. Everybody's running outside looking for spaceships. And it was a phenomenon that was so instant, it was studied over and over again how you could motivate an entire country through fear and through the media. You can sort of see where COVID comes in here, right? And so they called it gaslighting. In 1944, Ingrid Bergman starred in the movie. She was the niece of a famous actress that died but had been given some jewels, and everybody knew that, but Ingrid Bergman inherited the flat, in London they have those like apartments, and she locked all the actresses' stuff in the attic. It was too emotional to look through, and this guy comes along, and he befriends her, courts her, marries her, and then he would say, I'm going to go smoke my pipe, and he'd go out for a walk, and he would go down the street, around the back, up this fire escape, go under the roof, open the window, climb in, turn on the gas lamp in the attic so he could root around looking for these jewels. But when he turned the gas lamp on in the attic, it got dimmer in her bedroom. And she would say, whenever you go for a walk, the light in my bedroom gets dimmer. He's like, your eyes are playing tricks on you. The stress is getting to you. I think you're seeing things. I think you're having some psychological problems. We need to take you to a psychologist. I mean, the whole movie goes on, and he's about to sign her away into an insane asylum so he could dig through the attic all he wants. And the guy across the street noticed that whenever he goes for a walk, the light gets on in the attic and it gets dimmer in the bedroom, and he walks in and breaks the story, and then the police come and take the guy away. But it went into our vernacular called gaslighting, where you don't just do it to one person, you do it to a whole country. And you feed them these lies and lies and lies. And so this is psychology today. Gaslighting. Victims of gaslighting are systematically fed false information that leads them to question what they know to be true. They end up doubting their memory, their perception, even their sanity. So this is what they've been doing to us. You see that one YouTube video where it has a local news announcer saying, we have to be careful because this is dangerous to democracy. And then it goes to another news announcer saying the exact same thing, and then another, and then so pretty soon you have like a couple hundred of them in these little squares, and then we got to be very careful because this is dangerous to democracy. They're all saying the exact same words. And you can't help but think, wait a second, you're the one that's dangerous to democracy, right? So they're doing that projection. They're blaming the other people when they're the ones that are been co-opted. World War II, you had the Army and Air Force had a motion picture service. I served in the Army. What do you do? I make motion pictures. It's like, why would they do that? Are they just want to entertain? No, they realized the power of media to sway the country. I actually talked to a soldier that was there, and they had a table in the lobby to enlist people. And he saw the movie, and the guys came back all heroes, and he goes and he signs up. And Joseph Goebbels in Germany was their minister of what? Propaganda. And so he realized two things. One, that we are social creatures and will do what we see other people doing. And then fear. And so he decides to orchestrate a Colosseum event with 100,000 people. And they would begin to give the Hitler salute in the front. And it would work its way back like a wave at a football game. And it would be getting closer to you, and then you'd feel pressure, and you'd give it, and then people would see you give it, they'd feel pressure to give it. And with the fear of the war, and then you leaving things, and everybody must be on board with this because I was there, and they were all manipulated by this group to go in with the Nazis. And Joseph Goebbels talked about it's the absolute right of the state to supervise the formation of public opinion. Think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play. And then Lord Acton, the British commentator or statesman, said official truth is not actual truth. Right? So whatever they come out with on the assassination attempt, whatever the official this thing that comes out in 60 days, you can pretty well guarantee that official truth is not actual truth. And here is Kissinger. It's not a matter of what is true that counts, but a matter of what is perceived to be true. And so we share this because, number one, it's being used against us every day. And the only way to break free from it is to not care about what people think about you. And what gives you courage to not care about what people think about you is what God thinks about you. And Jesus told Peter, pray lest you fall into temptation. And I thought, part of praying is you're thinking about God. And if you're thinking about God, it makes it hard to think about sin. It's hard to have those two thoughts in the same brain at the exact same time. It's hard to think about sin and think about God at the same time, right? So if you're filling your mind with God, then you're not going to do. And it's when we think about God and how big He is and that He loves us, then we don't care as much about what other people say about us, and you're freed from that. So anyway. Nancy Pelosi called it the wrap-up smear. You lie about somebody and then it's a diversionary tactic. You demonize them and then you wrap-up smear. You smear somebody with falsehoods and then it's reported in the press. Harry Reid lied that Mitt Romney didn't pay his taxes, and then Mitt Romney loses, and then Time Magazine's interviewing Mitt Romney and said, we fact-checked, Romney did pay his taxes. And he said, I lied about Romney, but he didn't win, did he? It doesn't matter if it's true. There's no God, there's no right or wrong, it's just winning. And if you can lie and win, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, signed off on Uranium One, where a fifth of the U.S. uranium was transferred to Russia. At the same time, she gets a $145 million contribution to her Clinton Foundation. So what does she do? She pays for a Steele dossier to accuse Trump of colluding with Russia. She accuses him of exactly what she's guilty of, right? And when she's finally caught, all she had to do was pay a $113,000 fine to the FEC. Right? Hillary Clinton campaign pays $113,000 FEC fine in admission of guilt for producing the Steele dossier. I mean, for years, Trump had to go through an impeachment trial because of it, and she just gets off with a little hand slap. And then Biden's on C-SPAN saying, I told Ukraine, unless you stop investigating my son, I'm going to hold back billions to USA. He's extorting them. So what do? They accuse Trump of extorting Ukraine. He has to go through another impeachment trial. And anyway, the Apostle Paul was in Jerusalem praying. The Pharisees caught him and stirred up a riot. And then the Romans rescued Paul, and he has to go through a trial. And Tertullus began to accuse Paul, saying, we have found this man a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition among the Jews, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes who's gone about to profane the temple. And Paul answered, they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogue, nor can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. The Pharisees stirred up the insurrection at the Capitol, but they blamed innocent Paul. And so Nero set fire in Rome, but he blamed the Christians. And the Pharisees even accused Jesus of being demon-possessed. And then Adam did it to God. He said, it's the woman you gave me, right? So he blamed shit that he projected. And Alinsky, fear of man is the most potent weapon. So we have to realize that and not be swayed by it. So I think that is all I was going to talk about tonight. And let's see here. And then I wanted to come with a little encouragement. So you have a wicked, wicked king of Judah named Manasseh, and he's sacrificing children to Molech. The prophets come to him and said, you're filling the streets of Jerusalem with the blood of these innocent children. God is fed up. It is over. So judgment was pronounced. But Manasseh has a grandson named Josiah. He's 8 years old when he becomes king. A teenager, he starts to seek the Lord. When he's in his early 20s, he tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed. And they come out of the temple with the law of God. Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said that Manasseh had not just killed babies, that he tried to destroy every copy of the law he could find. And that this was supposedly the original one Moses had wrapped in burlap, buried under a bunch of stuff in the temple, and they bring it out, and they read it to this young king, Josiah. And he rips his garments and repents. And he sends messengers to a prophetess in town named Huldah, the wife of the king's tailor. And they ask what's going to happen. And she said, tell the man that sent you that judgment is coming, but not during his lifetime, because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so for the rest of the 31-year reign of Josiah, there's peace and prosperity. He has this enormous Passover, the biggest one ever. He tears down Sodomite temples, even temples that Solomon had built. So after Solomon built the temple, he backslid and built a bunch of pagan temples. And then Josiah sent the priests, Levites out to teach the law, and during that revival is when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were little boys, and they came to know the Lord. And so the idea is that I'm praying for a Josiah generation. We deserve judgment, but if we repent, God will put it off. And then I read a lot of history, and I see the trend, and I like to explain it like a freshman chemistry class. The teacher has a beaker with a solution and pours in a catalyst that causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates and settles to the bottom of the beaker, and the other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and flows to the top of the beaker. So the time period we are living in is our solution in the beaker. The crises of our time period is the catalyst that's poured in. And some people's response to that crisis is to precipitate, to run away, to hide, to deny their faith, deny God, and even take the mark of the beast. How can I survive unless the government's my nanny? And other people's response to the crisis is to get more effervescent, get more bubbly. Says, okay, God, there's a crisis. Where do you need me? Right? And then you read through history, the bubonic plague, you got these election brothers, and they would go out there and minister to people and give Christian burials to the dead. And then you had, all the different wars and famines. Whenever there's a crisis, Christians were known to running to the need. I was in the U.S. Capitol, and they have a statue of Father Damien. Every state puts 2 statues in the Capitol. And Father Damien was put in there by Hawaii. And the whaling ships would come through Hawaii and give diseases to the Hawaiians they did not have immunity to, and they would get leprosy. And they had an island called Molokai. And they would take these Hawaiian lepers and shove them off onto this, and they had a little beach area, but then they had this 300-foot cliff, and nobody could get from one side to the other, so this was like the leper colony. And then they would even have their boats pull up, and they wouldn't even land the boats. They would just shove the leper into the waters, and we don't want to get close to them, right? And Father Damien goes over there, and for decades, he goes right to the leper colony, and he ministers, and he takes care and loves on all these lepers, and made such an impact that they put his statue at the Capitol in Honolulu, and they put his statue in the U.S. Capitol. Christians were known for running to the need. Instead of, stay away from me, stay away from me. No, it's like, okay, there's a need, God. I'm already dead. My life is hid with Christ and God. Where do you need me? Right? And so I wanted to leave you with that encouragement, that every generation has a crisis. If we get through this crisis, there'll be another one. If we get through that crisis, there'll be another one. Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. This is the time that he chose us to be alive. Now, I sort of think we're getting close to the end, and we're the bride of Christ, and every romance novel builds up to a decision-making moment, a forsaking of all others and choosing the one. And I think God is pushing us to a decision-making moment. And some people are going to choose the all others. They're going to want to be liked and friend they didn't follow. They don't want anybody to say anything bad about them. And others are going to say, I don't care about the all others. All I care about is Jesus. Right? And I think God is pushing the world to this moment. And with that thought, someday I want to remind you that you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end the talk. So have a good evening. But you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. Imagine you've been up there for 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold. Maybe you meet Moses. That'd be pretty cool. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven. Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions, many dwelling places. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. They'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get in the burning bush in the wilderness, didn't burn up. And the logs don't. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think. And I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. I don't know. But imagine we all get there and he has a big living room the size of this. And he's sitting right at your table. And after the small talk's over, you say, Moses, tell us the story. I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. Moses stands up, the room gets quiet, and he goes, it looked hopeless. The government was trying to kill us. We were totally unarmed. It was so lopsided, but I just stood there with my staff and said, God, use me. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. And then we're going to see David. Say, David, tell us your story. And he goes, it was terrible. This giant Goliath and all these Goliaths were too chicken and scared. I said, enough of that. Took my little sling, hit him in the head, took his own sword, chopped his head off. And then we'll say Esther. And she said, whether I die, I die. I'm going to go in and talk to the king, right? One by one, they're going to go around the table. It's going to be really exciting. And then everyone at the table is going to look at you. Say, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What was going on down on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What are they saying about God in your country, the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb? Or sex, that God himself created, that in the beginning he made them male and female. What did you do when the whole world was against you and they were saying bad things about you? And they're all sitting on the edge of their chairs just looking at you. What are you going to say? I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus walk in the room and a big screen come down and him show all kinds of miracles and people coming to the Lord and great things happening and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do down on earth, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and that mountain that held you back was this little fear of man. What are people going to say about me? Are they going to cancel me? Are they going to post something bad about me? I let that fear of man hold me back from doing all this great stuff for the Lord. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those great things that you'll be known for forever. It's like a basketball game. Jesus is the coach. You're on the bench, and he comes over and slaps you on the back and says, okay, your turn, get in the game. You're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. He goes, yeah, I know it. It's your turn. Get in the game. He's like, coach, somebody just got knocked out. They said bad things about him in the newspaper. It's like, yeah, you can do this. You're 7 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. When the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord raises up a standard against him. Though 1,000 fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, it shall not come nigh thee. Right? Out of all the world's history, God chose for you to be alive right now. Yeah. He knows every globalist, dirty backroom deal. He knows all that Secret Service. He knows all those Obama lies. He knows all that stuff. You know, no coach saves his worst player to the end of the game. He saves his best batter to bat cleanup, right? Bases loaded, send in Babe Ruth. He saves his fastest runner to run the last leg of the relay. I believe God has chosen, instead of being, oh, it looks really bad, help me, pull me out of this mess. No, he sent you here. You are his star player. Out of all the world's history, he chose for you to be alive right now. He's given you his words, given you his spirit, he's given you a great mind, given you great friends, right? This is your chance to do those great things that you'll be known for forever. Yeah. God bless you.